This is a summary of Chapter 11, Race, Ethnicity, and Racism of the textbook Introduction to Sociology by Giddens et al. The learning objectives for this chapter includes the ability to understand the different meanings of the terms race and ethnicity and understand why race is a highly contested concept. In this chapter, we will learn several key concepts that are important for understanding racism in the contemporary United States. Things such as colorblind racism, white privilege, institutional racism, overt racism, and microaggression. This chapter will allow us to familiarize ourselves with the history and social dimensions of ethnic relations in the United States and to recognize the importance of historical roots of ethnic conflicts, particularly in expansion of Western colonialism, and understand the different models used for a multi-ethnic society. What is a minority group? A minority group is a group of people in a given society who, because of their distinct physical or cultural characteristics, find themselves in situations of inequality compared with the dominant group within society. Members of minority groups, such as Spanish speakers in the United States, often see themselves as distinct from the majority. Race. Race is a socially constructed category rooted in the belief that there are fundamental differences among human beings associated with a phenotype and ancestry. Racial distinctions are more than ways of describing differences, they are also important factors in the reproduction of patterns of power and inequality. Ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to cultural values and norms that distinguish the members of a given group from others. An ethnic group is one whose members share a distinct awareness of a common cultural identity, separating them from other groups. In virtually all societies, ethnic differences are associated with variations in power and material wealth. Where ethnic differences are also racial, such as divisions, are sometimes especially pronounced. Where ethnic differences are also racial, such divisions are sometimes especially pronounced. Defining racism. Racism is defined as the attribution of characteristics of superiority or inferiority to a population sharing certain physically inherited characteristics. Racism is one specific form of prejudice focusing on physical variations among people. Racist attitudes became entrenched during the period of Western colonial expansion, but seem also to rest on mechanisms of prejudice and discrimination found in human societies today. Prejudice. Prejudice is the holding of preconceived ideas about an individual or group, ideas that are resistant to change even in the face of new information. Stereotyping. This is thinking in terms of fixed and inflexible categories. And scapegoats. Individuals or groups blamed for wrongs that were not of their own doing. Scapegoating is normally directed against groups that are relatively powerless. Discrimination. Discrimination is a behavior that denies to the members of a particular group resources or rewards that can be obtained by others. Racism in the United States today, some concepts that I wanted to take a closer look at includes colorblind racism, white privilege, institutional racism, overt racism, and microaggressions. Colorblind. To be colorblind, according to sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, He defines colorblindness as a means of maintaining racial inequality without appearing to be racist. One significant aspect of colorblindness is white privilege, the unacknowledged and unearned assets that benefit whites in their everyday lives. Institutional racism, the idea that racism occurs through the respected and established institutions of society rather than through the hateful actions of bad people. This concept was developed in the 1960s by Black Power activists Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, and taken up by sociologists in the 1970s. Those who focus on institutional racism study how institutions have practices supporting white supremacy built into the fabric of their operations. For example, if you take an organization like the NYPD, many people argue that within the NYPD, there is a built in racism is built into the organization, in that when you look at practices such as racial profiling, that is one example that is tied to NYPD as reflecting institutional racism. George Floyd and institutional racism. So, similar to my reference earlier, where I spoke to NYPD, another example of institutional racism, again, having to do with the police department, is the case of George Floyd, a black man who was killed by police officers exercising excessive amounts of force. Floyd's murder brought attention to systematic institutional racism, and it resulted in an outpouring of protests in cities across the world. Overt racism. Racism can be expressed overtly by bigoted individuals through individual attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. It can be sustained by the ideological racist statements of political leaders. Overt racism saw a resurgence during the campaign and 2016 to 2020 term of President Donald Trump. Racial microaggressions. Racial microaggressions are small, slight indignities or acts of disrespect that are hurtful to people of color, even though they are often perpetuated by well meaning whites. The idea of microaggression was originally proposed in the 1970s by Chester M. Pierce, an African American psychiatrist. Some examples are asking Asian Americans where they were born or telling them that they speak good English. I remember there was a time that my daughter went to China and she had braids in her hair, and a lot of folks would want to touch her hair. And that, in essence, was an act of microaggression. Race and racism in historical and comparative perspective. Scientific racism. Today's ethnic and racial divisions stem from European colonial expansion into the Americas, Africans, and Australasia, as well as the slave trade between Africa and the Americas. This early period of colonization coincided with the rise of scientific racism. Scientific racism is simply the use of research data to justify or reify beliefs about superiority or inferiority of particular racial groups. Much of the data used to justify some such claims are flawed or biased. The rise of racism. Racism has flourished for several reasons. Racism helped justify the exploitative relations that Europeans established with the people they conquered, and a position between the colors white and black are cultural symbols that was deeply rooted in European culture. The invention and diffusion of the concept of race itself. Apartheid. We've heard a lot about apartheid in South Africa, and the name Nelson Mandela rings all too true for us. What is apartheid? The notion of superiority of the white race remains a key element of white racism. It resulted in systems such as apartheid, which is a system of racial segregation that was established in South Africa. Blacks in the United States. Now we're turning our eyes to look at minority groups in the United States. By 1780, there were nearly 4 million slaves in the American South. Slaves had no legal rights, but they resisted through disobedience, rebellion, and cultural creativity. The abolition of slavery did little to better the lives of black people. The black codes simply replaced old system of slavery with a new system of social, political, and economic discrimination. Blacks eventually migrated from the south to the north, where there was an increase of jobs in the north, and with industrialization and the lack of need for human labor, um, it was then prudent for blacks to be able to move to the north. Despite having lived in northern urban areas for generations, African Americans today still face conditions of neighborhood segregation and poverty that other immigrants faced only upon arrival. The Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, you may have heard of the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Ed, and this was a case that originated in Kansas. And the essence to that case was separate educational facilities were considered inherently unequal. The decision of Board versus Brown versus Board of Ed marked the beginning of a series of boycotts, sit ins, protests, and marches promoting civil rights. To the left of the screen, you are looking at one of the first of 8 black students that that attended school in the segregated South. And in attending school, there's a story behind this that they had to attend school with armed guards because the society was so up in arms for these little black kids to attend school. To the right of the screen, you see Rosa Parks sitting on a bus, and as you recall from history, that was something that was not allowed for her to sit in the front of the bus, and that also was a source that fueled the civil rights actions. After the civil rights movement, um, a substantial black middle class emerged, but a significant American African underclass remains poor. To the right, you have Dr. Martin Luther King giving his speech for which he acclaimed fame. Now let's take a look at Hispanics and Latinos in the United States. There are 4 main groups of Hispanics in the United States: Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, El Salvadorians, and Cubans. Mexican Americans um, are descendants of people who lived in Mexican territory taken by the United States in 1848, present day California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Subsequent migrations from Mexico. Latino refers to people descended from Latin America, and Hispanic refers to anyone living in the United States who descended from Spanish speaking regions. Mexicans in the United States. In the post World War II era, up to the early 1960s, Mexican workers were admitted without much restriction to the United States. Um, they were used primarily as laborers, and when we needed laborers, we had our Mexicans come to do our harvesting or our planting. But when the time of reaping or planting was up, we sent them back to Mexico. And this continued for a while. Despite this, what happened was we had a phase of quotas on legal immigrants and deportations of undocumented migrants. Today, undocumented migrants continue to enter the country. Puerto Ricans and Cubans. Puerto Ricans have been divided about whether the island, currently a Commonwealth of the United States, should retain of in, its present status or opt for independence. It's going to be interesting in the year 2023 to see how this unfolds, as this is an agenda that is still on the table. As a group, Cubans have the highest family incomes of all Latinos. This is because most Cubans in the first wave of immigration were white collar professionals fleeing communism. The second wave of immigrants were less affluent, but were also political refugees rather than economic refugees. Asian Americans. About 6% of the population of the United States is of Asian origin. Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Indian Americans form the largest group. There are also significant numbers of Vietnamese, Koreans, Japanese, and Pakistanis. Most of the early Chinese immigrants settled in California and worked in heavy industries such as mining and railroad construction. In 1882, the United States established a ban on Chinese immigration. And this was because there was a fear that there were so many Chinese in the country. The greater American population felt that if we're not careful, we'll be overrun by the Chinese. And so they hazed to stem Chinese immigration. During World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, the Japanese American, despite their American citizenship, were forced to live in remote relocation centers. Following the passage of the new Immigration Act of 1965, large scale immigration of Asian Americans again took place. Models of ethnic integration. We have things such as assimilation, the melting pot, pluralism, and multiculturalism. And these are concepts that basically state how America as a whole either accepted or did not accept immigration. Now, I want you guys to take a minute, and while I'm not going to focus on this chart, I want you guys to take a minute to look at this chart to see um, global, and it's a global map 11.2, to see global migratory movements since 1973. And just very quickly, you'll see a lot of migration to Northeast United States and a lot of migration to Europe. Immigration and emigration. Immigration is the movement of people from one country to another for the purpose of settlement, while emigration is the movement of people out of the country to settle to another. Four models of migration. There's a classical model, the colonial model, the guest workers, and the illegal models. The classical model is where a country encourages immigration and promises citizenship to newcomers. Although restrictions and quotas limit the annual intake, this applies to countries like the United States and Australia and Canada. The colonial model is where a country grants preference to immigrants from former colonies. This applies to countries like England and France. One of the things we must note with England is that one of the extended colonial model was to the Caribbean countries. However, in recent years, we've seen how, and that was called the Windrush generation. We've seen how this is somehow backfiring on England. The guest workers model, this is where immigrants are admitted on a temporary basis, but they do not receive citizenship, even after long periods of stay. This applies to countries This applies to countries like Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany. Illegal models of immigration are where immigrants who enter a country either secretly or under non immigration pretense often live illegally outside the realm of the official society. Forces behind globalization, things such as push factors, pull factors, macro level factors, and micro level factors, are where countries either force people to immigrate or tend to attract immigration. Do migrants help or hinder a nation's economy? This is a topic for discussion. Some people will say immigrants here take our jobs, but the reality is immigrants don't necessarily take jobs that Americans are pining for. They take jobs that Americans don't want to do, right? So when you look at the National Immigration Forum, it estimated that immigrants contributed significantly to the economy as again they take work that Americans would rather not engage in. Another question is, has real progress been made since the civil rights movement in the 1960s? Yes, an increasing number of Black Americans have joined the middle class, acquiring college degrees, professional jobs, and new homes. At the same time, whites still fare far better than Blacks, and you will have Blacks who have actually attained middle class status, but also experience treatment from whites that tend to make that status not as inspiring as it ought to be. um, for example, you have a black person working in corporate America as a manager. That person faces racism, so that person doesn't really enjoy the job that they have probably worked so hard for, simply because the position is met, not the position, the person within the position is met by racist or racist attitudes. I want you guys to take a moment and look at these two charts. Figure 11.2 that looks at the percentage of population with high school diplomas as they're categorized by race. Also, the percentage of people with bachelor's degrees also identified by race. Another chart that I want you to take a look at is figure 11.3, the real median household income by race and Hispanic origin, which charts from the year 1967 to 2018. How can ethnic conflicts be reduced? What are some examples of ethnic conflict? Genocide, ethnic cleansing, segregation. These are practices that, with education, with changes in political and economic policies, can actually be successfully addressed. Conflict and economic power. Many commentators have argued that the best way to reduce ethnic conflict is to establish democracy and a free market. Professor Amy Chua contests this view, arguing that although democracy and the market economy are in principle benefit sources, they must be grounded in an effective system of law and civil society. Where they are not, new and acute ethnic conflicts can emerge. This concludes the summary of Chapter 11 of Giddens et al.